Have you ever noticed that the person holding you back the most is rarely your fiercest critic? It is rarely the competitor working longer hours. It is rarely the stranger whose success appears overnight. No, the most persistent obstacle standing between you and the life you want is almost always the version of you that refuses to focus on becoming better. Think about this for a moment. How many people wake up every morning already exhausted before the day has begun? Not because they worked all night, not because life is unfair, but because their attention has been scattered across a dozen directions before their feet ever touch the floor. They check what someone else earned this week. They absorb news that has nothing to do with their goals. They scroll through lives curated to appear perfect. They compare chapter 1 of their own story to chapter 20 of someone else's highlight reel. And by the time the real day arrives, every ounce of energy has already been spent elsewhere. Here is something most people don't understand. The skill that will carry you further than any talent is the ability to concentrate your attention on what truly matters. Not for a weekend, not for a month, but for years. Most ambitious people begin their journey excited and motivated. They ride that momentum for weeks, sometimes months. Then the first difficult season arrives and the enthusiasm evaporates. They were emotionally invested in the dream instead of becoming the kind of person capable of carrying the dream. There is a profound difference between the two. Let me tell you something I have come to believe after watching hundreds of lives unfold. The world does not reward intensity. The world rewards consistency. Intensity burns bright and disappears. Consistency shows up quietly and stays. Most people misunderstand this. They believe the secret to extraordinary results is dramatic effort. But dramatic effort exhausts. Quiet consistency compounds. One of the most powerful humans alive is someone who improved themselves 1% every single day for years. Nobody knows their name. They have no followers and no applause. Yet every area of their life has steadily moved in the upward direction. Jim Rohn once taught a deceptively simple idea that reshaped the way I think about success. He said, if you want to change your life, you must work harder on yourself than you do on your job. Not work harder than your colleagues on your job. Work harder on the person you are becoming. Because everything you accomplish in life will flow downstream from who you are. A better character produces better decisions. Better decisions produce better results. Better results produce better circumstances. The outside rarely improves until the inside improves. That is not philosophy. That is simply the architecture of reality. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you invested a full hour into your own growth without checking your phone, without telling anyone, without looking for any external reward? When was the last time you read 20 pages of a book that challenged your thinking? When was the last time you sat in silence long enough to hear the honest voice inside? When was the last time you practiced a skill with the patience of someone who plans to use it for decades? If you cannot remember, that single sentence may explain more about your life than 1,000 pages of advice ever could. Here is another truth that most people never recognize. The reason your results have plateaued is rarely because your goals are too small. The reason your results have plateaued is because your personal growth has been smaller than your ambition. Your dream has grown faster than your discipline. Your vision has expanded faster than your character. And the gap between those two things is where frustration lives. Every day, that gap quietly grows wider. The solution is rarely a new strategy. The solution is becoming a person capable of executing the strategy you already have. Let me tell you a story. There was once a young watchmaker in a small Swiss village who was obsessed with making the most precise pocket watches ever crafted in his region. He studied at the side of his grandfather. He learned the foundation. He practiced daily. His workshop was a single room with a window, a wooden table, a few hand tools, and absolute silence. Every morning he opened his tiny case, laid out his instruments, and began shaping the tiny inner workings of a timepiece. The work was repetitive. The work was slow. The work was invisible to anyone watching. Every tiny spring had to be filed. Every tiny gear had to be calibrated. Every tiny screw had to be tightened with the exact correct pressure. Visitors rarely came. Customers waited months. Critics called the work outdated. Yet when someone finally held one of those watches in their palm and closed their eyes, they could feel it. The gentle hum of something made with patience. The kind of perfection that cannot be faked. One afternoon, a young apprentice finally asked the watchmaker how he stayed motivated through such repetitive work. The old man set down his loop. looked at the tiny movement half completed, and said something the apprentice never forgot. "I do not measure my days by how many watches I finish. I measure my days by how much better my hands become." That single sentence is the foundation of every meaningful life. The world celebrates finished products. The world rarely notices the steady hands that produce them, but those hands eventually create masterpieces the world cannot ignore. Think about this principle for a moment. Your life is the same workshop. Your habits are the tiny moving parts. Your discipline is the graduated file. Your patience is the steady hand. And the masterpiece is coming much faster than you realize. Each quiet repetition is shaping it. Each ordinary morning is bending the metal into its final form. Each skipped excuse is tightening one more screw with precision. But you cannot rush the process without distorting the result. You cannot abandon it without losing the masterpiece altogether. Let me tell you another story. There was a gardener who had spent 37 years cultivating a small plot of land behind his modest home. He never sold what he grew. He never advertised it. He never entered competitions. He simply tended the soil every morning before the sun had fully risen. Neighbors watched him for decades. Some laughed. Some tried to recruit him into more productive hobbies. He smiled politely and went back to work. One spring, a journalist asked him why. Why waste so much care on something so invisible? The gardener set down his watering can and said, "I do not tend this garden because anyone will see it. I tend this garden because it is what I have been entrusted with. Growth is what living things do." That answer is worth memorizing, because most people have replaced tending what has been entrusted to them with chasing what looks impressive from the outside. They want neighbors to notice. They want social feeds to admire. They want strangers to celebrate. But the gardener was not tending his reputation. He was tending his character. He was cultivating the patience, the consistency, the humility, and the love that quietly leak into every other area of his life. That is why his marriage lasted 48 years. That is why his children became exceptional human beings. That is why strangers sensed something different in his presence. Nothing about his life was loud. Everything about his life was deeply tended. Here is what most people don't understand. Your life does not need another motivational phrase. Your life needs the gardener's hours, the watchmaker's precision, the apprentice's patience, the farmer's quiet stewardship of what was entrusted to your hands. That is how character is built. That is how discipline is built. That is how confidence is built. That is how peace is built. Think about this. Jim Rohn often reminded audiences that everyone wants to live on top of the mountain. But every person who lives on top of the mountain had to pass through difficult valleys along the way. Nobody skips them. Nobody shortcuts them. The valleys are not interruptions. The valleys are the training ground. They teach things success could never teach. They teach endurance. They teach resourcefulness. They teach humility. They teach identity. And success without those qualities becomes a brittle, fragile thing waiting to collapse. The person who has survived their seasons of winter becomes the kind of person whose summer never destroys them. Let me tell you something your future self is trying to whisper to you right now. There are two kinds of pain. There is the pain of discipline, and there is the pain of regret. The pain of discipline weighs ounces. It feels heavy in the moment, but it is short-lived. It is the weight of getting up earlier, the weight of practicing instead of scrolling, the weight of saving the money instead of spending it, the weight of choosing growth when choosing comfort was so much easier. The pain of regret weighs tons. It arrives years later when the consequences finally arrive. It is the weight of missed decades, the weight of neglected relationships, the weight of delayed dreams, the weight of unkept promises to yourself. And regret never whispers. Regret shouts. Regret becomes the question you cannot stop asking in the quiet hours of the night. The honest truth is this. Most people will endure the heavier pain because the lighter pain feels hard right now. They will endure regret because discipline feels inconvenient. And they will spend an entire life wondering why success never stays with them for long. Let me ask you something. What would happen if you treated yourself like someone you were responsible for helping? That simple reframe has the power to quietly transform everything. Because most people are kinder to others than they are to themselves. They would never tell a friend they are hopeless. They would never tell a colleague they are a failure. They would never say to a child what they say to themselves every single morning. Yet somehow, when it comes to their own private conversations, The language becomes cruel, dismissive, and unforgiving. Stop rehearsing your failures. Stop rehearsing your limitations. Stop rehearsing the version of yourself that the world told you was not enough. Begin rehearsing the version of yourself your future self is trying to introduce you to. Here is another truth that changed my perspective forever. You cannot hate yourself into becoming someone you love. You cannot punish yourself into becoming someone better. You cannot criticize yourself into becoming successful. Growth has never worked that way. Growth requires honesty, responsibility, and patient compassion. Honest about your mistakes, responsible for your choices, compassionate enough to keep going even when those choices were not your best. There is a profound difference between the person who failed at something and the person who believes they are a failure. The first person still has every possibility open. The second person often stops trying altogether. Let me tell you a story about an old stonecutter that has stayed with me for years. He worked in a small quarry in a quiet region. He was not the most gifted. He was not the fastest. He was not the most educated. He was simply the most patient. Every morning he walked to the same section of stone. He lifted the same tools. He chipped the same surface. He measured the same progress. Every visitor to the quarry assumed he had been working on the same block for years. He had. Day after day, the shape changed so slowly that no one else could see it, but he could. The stone was becoming a sculpture. There were days when his hands bled. There were days when progress was invisible even to him. There were days when his neighbors told him he should consider a different line of work. One afternoon, a young visitor finally asked, "How long has this taken you?" The stonecutter set down his chisel and smiled. "The truth is, I do not count the days. I count the listens I have obeyed. Every time the stone whispered that it wanted to become more than what it appeared to be, I obeyed that voice one more strike at a time." That single image explains more about success than most books ever written. A stone does not become a sculpture because the sculptor shouted at it. A stone becomes a sculpture because the sculptor kept showing up and paying attention. The sculptor is simply having a long, quiet, faithful conversation with one block of stone. And that is exactly what your growth requires, a long, quiet, faithful conversation between who you are today and who you are capable of becoming. Imagine for a moment that your future self was sitting across from you right now. They look calmer than you, they look steadier than you, they look more patient than you, they look more content than you. They would not lecture you, but they would gently say, "You are spending too much attention on things that will never matter. You are spending too much energy defending things that are already gone. You are spending too much time proving things to people who will never believe you anyway. Come back. Return to the lesson. Return to the practice. Return to the slow, private, faithful repetition that builds everything meaningful over time." The future you is not asking for urgency. The future you is asking for faithfulness. Here is what most people don't fully appreciate. Personal development is not about learning more information. Personal development is about transforming the way you live with the information you already have. There is a difference between reading 50 books and applying one lesson for 10 years. There is a difference between attending another seminar and having one quiet hour of reflection afterwards. There is a difference between collecting quotes and becoming the kind of person whose life naturally produces quotes. Most people collect, few people live it. Yet living it is what changes everything. Let me tell you another story. There was a young man who became obsessed with becoming a published writer. He collected notebooks, he attended workshops, he bookmarked advice, he followed successful authors, he consumed every possible resource about the craft. Yet years passed and he had never completed a single manuscript. One evening, an older writer finally asked him a clarifying question. "What is your daily writing practice?" The young man hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I mean the daily practice," the older writer said. "The one you show up to, whether anyone is watching or not." The young man had no answer. He had been preparing for years to begin. Within 12 months of beginning a small, consistent daily practice, he had produced more pages than he had collected notebooks in all the previous years. The dream required not more information. The dream required quiet repetition. This pattern quietly ruins thousands of lives every year. People confuse preparation with progress. People confuse consumption with creation. People confuse research with mastery. The world is filled with people who have studied everything and built nothing. The world also contains people who studied only what they needed and built quietly for years until their work spoke for itself. The choice is yours. Which kind of person do you want to become? Think about something for a moment. How many hours of your life this week were spent absorbing other people's content? How many hours were spent creating something of your own? How many hours were spent shaping your own character? The honest answer to those questions will reveal where your future is currently being built. And whether you like the answer or not, those hours are quietly choosing your future more decisively than any strategy ever will. Here is what most people don't understand about seasons. Every meaningful achievement passes through 4 distinct seasons. There is the winter of clarity, the spring of planting, the summer of effort, and the autumn of harvest. Most people only want the autumn. They want the visible harvest. They want the public reward. They want the applause. They do not realize that they are skipping the seasons that produce it. Every extraordinary harvest in history has been preceded by an invisible winter of silent root growth, by a deliberate spring of patient preparation, by a disciplined summer of consistent effort, and finally by an autumn of dignified harvest. If you skip the spring, you cannot have the autumn. The harvest cannot be negotiated. The harvest always honors the season. Let me ask you another question. What season are you currently in? And are you accepting that season, or are you resisting it? Most of the suffering in human life comes from resisting the current season. People in winter wish for summer. People in summer wish for winter. People in spring rush toward autumn. People in autumn cannot accept that another winter is coming. But nature never resists the season it is in. It simply fulfills the assignment of that season. And the person who learns to do the same becomes a creator instead of a victim of their own life. Let me tell you a story that captures this idea beautifully. A small boy once planted a seed in his backyard. Every morning he ran outside to see if it had grown. For days it looked exactly the same. He became disappointed. He became impatient. He told his grandfather that he believed the soil was broken. The grandfather smiled and walked him to the spot. He pointed to the ground and said, "What do you see?" The boy said he saw nothing. The grandfather said, "That is where you are wrong. Beneath that soil, the seed has been working through the night. It has cracked its shell. It has pushed tiny roots into the darkness. It has reached for sources of water you cannot see. By the time the green tip finally appears above the surface, the entire invisible foundation will already be in place." That is how meaningful growth works. You cannot see it happening, but it has been happening every single day. Your invisible effort is not wasted. Your silent progress is not wasted. Your faithfulness in the unseen season is not wasted. Sometimes growth is happening so far beneath the visible surface that the world will never understand why your confidence is rising. But your confidence is rising because you know the truth. The roots have been quietly expanding beneath you. The branches are about to appear. Here is another truth about focus. Every time you allow outside noise to fill your inner space, you donate a piece of your potential to someone else's agenda. Every notification pulled you toward someone else's priority. Every argument pulled you into someone else's confusion. Every comparison pulled you away from your own assignment. Attention truly is the currency of achievement. Where attention flows, energy follows. Where energy follows, results grow. This is why learning to focus on yourself is not selfish. It is one of the most responsible decisions you will ever make. Because if you do not focus on yourself first, you will have nothing authentic to give anyone else. An unfocused person cannot become a focused parent. An unfocused person cannot become a focused leader. An unfocused person cannot become a focused partner. Improving yourself is not something you do for yourself alone. It is the foundation of every meaningful contribution you will ever make. Let me tell you one more story. There was an elderly violin teacher whose students often became famous soloists. Her waiting list stretched for years. Parents sometimes asked her what made her teaching so powerful. Her answer was always the same. They expected her to mention her training. They expected her to mention her famous teachers. They expected her to mention her awards. Instead, she said something surprising every time. "I teach my students to fall in love with private discipline. The world will only ever see the performance. The world will never see the empty practice rooms, the silent repetitions, the failed scales played 1,000 times before they became effortless. If a student cannot fall in love with that invisible season of their craft, they will never become someone the public will fall in love with. Imagine carrying that into every area of your life, every relationship, every career, every dream, every value that matters most to you. Can you fall in love with private discipline? Can you fall in love with the quiet season? Can you fall in love with the hours that produce every meaningful harvest? If you can, you will become a person who no longer needs external validation. You will become a person whose confidence is anchored deep within their own consistent practice. And nothing the outside world does will be able to take that from you. Here is what most people don't understand about identity. There is a quiet shift that happens once personal growth becomes your practice instead of your hobby. You stop being someone who is trying to become. You become someone who already is. Every promise you keep to yourself adds another layer. Every difficult moment you handle with patience strengthens another layer. Eventually you become someone whose identity is so quietly powerful that the world barely recognizes the change. They only notice the results. They only notice the steadiness. They only notice the calm. They never realize how many small choices went into building that calm. Let me tell you about the bamboo tree, because it holds one of the most underrated lessons in the world. A bamboo seed receives proper care, water, soil, and sunlight. For an entire year, nothing visible happens above the soil. Most gardeners would assume it failed. Most people would assume the seed was defective. But beneath the surface, the bamboo has been quietly establishing a root system so vast that without it, the tree could never grow to the heights it eventually becomes. Then, somewhere between the 5th and 6th year, the bamboo suddenly explodes upward. In a single season, it can grow 90 feet. From the outside, it appears to have happened overnight. From the inside, it was 5 years of invisible preparation. There are seasons of your life that will feel exactly like the bamboo's invisible years. Nothing visible is happening. Nobody notices the change. Your progress feels imperceptible. Your discipline feels unrewarded. Your patience feels unnecessary. Yet beneath the surface, your roots are expanding into something your future will depend upon. The most profound growth of your life will almost certainly happen in a season you never would have celebrated. Here is a final truth that deserves your full attention. You were not created to live a distracted life. You were not created to live a reactive life. You were not created to live someone else's assignment. You were not created to feed on every piece of noise the world offers you. You were created for depth. You were created for quality. You were created for contribution. You were created for meaning. You were created for the kind of focus that produces something the world quietly benefits from. The earlier you remember that, the earlier your days begin to count for something far larger than yourself. Let me tell you something one final time. The most successful people in the world did not have perfect circumstances. They had ordinary circumstances, plus ordinary discipline, plus ordinary patience, plus extraordinary time. That is the secret recipe. Time applied to ordinary discipline eventually produces extraordinary results. The only variable you control is what you do with your hours. Anything else is simply decoration around a small, faithful daily practice. Let me ask you something before we close. If you could meet the future version of yourself 10 years from today, what would that person quietly thank you for? Would they thank you for keeping the promises you have been keeping? Would they thank you for the books you read when nobody was watching? Would they thank you for the relationships you protected? Would they thank you for the difficult conversations you handled? Would they thank you for the discipline that felt boring but quietly built everything? Would they thank you for the seasons you accepted without complaining? That future version of you is being assembled right now, every single day, one decision at a time, one promise kept, one quiet act of discipline, one decision to keep one more promise to yourself even when no one applauds, one decision to invest in your growth before you invest in your image, one decision to choose character before you choose reputation, one decision to discipline your mind before you discipline your routine, one decision to focus on becoming before you focus on obtaining, one decision to protect your attention before the world spends it without permission, one decision to begin again after every honest failure without losing your dignity or your direction. Lives rarely change because of one dramatic moment. They change because one wise decision is repeated until it becomes a way of living. Years from now, people may look at your life and call you fortunate. They may say you had luck on your side. But you will know the quiet truth. You will remember the mornings when nobody watched. You will remember the evenings when quitting felt easier. You will remember the silent sacrifices that produced every private victory. You will remember choosing patience over impatience, depth over distraction, focus over comparison, growth over comfort. So as you leave today, please leave with a quiet commitment. Become slightly wiser than yesterday. Become slightly more disciplined than yesterday. Become slightly more patient than yesterday. Become slightly more focused than yesterday. Become slightly more honest with yourself than yesterday. Because the most extraordinary life is never produced by extraordinary people living extraordinary days. It is produced by ordinary people who refuse to stop improving themselves one small, faithful decision at a time. Focus on your mind because it shapes every choice you will make. Focus on your character because it shapes the legacy you will leave. Focus on your discipline because it shapes every dream you will attempt. And above all, focus on becoming the kind of person others can quietly admire. Not because of perfect words, but because of a deeply lived life.